It was right after Christmas. It started out like any other day. I went to work, and the kids knew that at 9 o'clock they had to be in Veneta at my work. We were going to stop and get their dad at his work and go to the dentist. About 8:40 in the morning, my son calls me and says, "Mom, the Freeman's home was on fire."
Lorraine's daughter, Laura Bible, spent the previous night at the Freeman's house, celebrating her friend Ashley Freeman's 16th birthday.
On the morning of December 30th, a local resident who was driving to work observed the fire at the Freeman's residence. And this person stopped between 5:30 and 6 a.m. and actually called in the fire with the Welch Volunteer Fire Department.
One of the county deputies walked into the place I worked and said, "Lorraine, I need to talk to you." So we go back to the office, and his first words were, "Do you know Ashley Freeman?" I said, "Yes, she's my daughter's best friend. In fact, Laura stayed again last night with the Freemans. But their house caught on fire, and my son's on his way there to help." I could just tell by his demeanor that something was wrong. He said, "Lorraine, the house is totally gone."
I was about 25 minutes away at the doctor's office, and they come and got me and said it was the sheriff's department on the phone. When I got on the scene, the undersheriff come over and got me. He walked me up to the house. He said that they had found a body laying across the bed, and they thought it was female.
I had seen Laura last the evening of December 25th at my grandparents' house, and never once did we think that that would be the last Christmas that would be normal.
My husband Jay and I were married in July of 1978. And in 1980, we had our first son, which is Bradley. And then we had Laura. She started walking when she was 9 months old, talking by the time she was a year and a half. By 2, she could put full sentences together and talk an adult conversation with you. So she talked all the time. And no matter what she's doing, she'd talk up a storm.
One of my favorite memories, we went to Colorado one year, and she was serenading everyone in the car. Later, once we got to Colorado, she goes across the road, climbs up on the side of this mountain with her boombox, and starts blasting Reba McEntire music. All you could hear was her voice over the top of the whole valley, as loud as you can possibly imagine. She loved being out with the farm animals. She loved being a cheerleader. And she was always right in the middle of everything that there was to do.
Ashley was kind of like a blooming flower. She was very happy, outgoing, had lots of friends, very athletic, very much outdoors person. She would hunt and fish with her dad. What made Ashley special is how much she genuinely cared about everyone and really everything.
When Ashley and Laura were little, we lived a mile between the two houses. So the kids would have play dates with each other. They made that bond, and it continued all the way till they got in high school.
When she hears about the fire, Lorraine drops everything and leaves work.
I called my husband. He came from work, and we drove to the Freemans.
The fire was extremely volatile. I mean, most everything had just collapsed, and it was just ashes and burnt debris.
He walked me up there, and he showed me the body that was laying across the bed that was badly burnt. Yeah, it was very difficult to recognize. They thought it was female. They thought it was Kathy. That was the first time for me to see a charred human body. And the visual of it and the odor of it stays with you, has stayed with me for 20 years now.
Lorraine and Jay pull up to the Freeman's house. But they only get as far as the driveway. Craig County deputies have the house blocked off.
The next 10 hours was standing 1,000 yards down the Freeman's driveway, not being allowed to go up. When I saw the county coroner when she come over, I asked her, because I knew her personally, I said, "Is that Kathy?" And she said, "I can't tell you 100%, but I know that the woman has a ring on her left hand and she has 4 children." I said, "That's Kathy." So where are Danny? Where are the 2 girls? By 4:30, it's starting to get dark. By 5 o'clock, it is pitch black, cold. The investigators say they're 100% sure there's nothing else there. So at 5 o'clock, they released the Freeman's house scene over to the families.
The deadly house fire is big news in this small town. Rumors spread and tips pour in. One tipster claims they saw Danny Freeman driving with Laura and Ashley in the car.
I knew Kathy more than I knew Danny. Kathy was just a mom, helped raising her 2 kids and doing the best she could. Danny was like all the dads. He went off to work, but there was things about him I wish I'd known back then. He had a black powder gun go off in his face, and he had to have some metal plates put in. And due to that, sometimes when he would get mad, he would go too far.
We did notice just a little bit of difference in his personality. He was a little bit quick-tempered at times. So when I'm standing there looking at Kathy's body, I'm instantly thinking, did Danny do this?
Did Danny kill Kathy and then force to take the girls because they're witnesses? Did Danny take the girls and do something with them?
Maureen and Jay stay at the scene for hours, but there's no news about Laura. They head home, no closer to finding their daughter.
So Jay and I got home probably 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, and Laura's room is right across from ours. You know your child isn't in her room where she should be. Is she freezing to death? Is she hungry? Does she have clothes? You think to yourself, how can you eat if your child's not? How can I sleep if I don't know where my child is?
Desperate for answers, Maureen goes back to the burnt remains of the Freeman's home.
So by the next morning, Jay and I go to the Freemans. When you walk into it, so everything's kind of wet and you smell the burn. The floors had all fell all the way to the ground, and you looking around and you say, how can they say the girls couldn't be here when the refrigerators, the deep freezes, the tables, the chairs fell down? How do you know the girls aren't underneath any of this stuff? And then you look over and you see there's something up there on that floor. Jay climbs up on the floor and then he helps me up. On there and we looked, you could instantly tell it was a body of a man. He had no face. No face.
The next morning, I immediately drove back out to the farm. And as I pull in, Jay is motioning for me to come up in the burnt house. So I get up there where Jay's pointing, and I see what looks like a charred body laying there, and I see shiny metallic material in the forehead. Well, I instantly knew that was Danny.
They made a discovery very quickly. They saw the remains and realized this is Danny Freeman. Immediately, they recontacted law enforcement and came back out to look at the scene again.
Maureen and Jay find Danny Freeman's burned body when investigators could not. Laura and Ashley, however, are still missing.
Your heart sinks into your stomach. It's something that you don't want to believe, but it's right there in front of you. You know you have to. And then your mind immediately has to go to the girls. We got to find the girls. It's a really bad feeling to see Danny laying there and then not knowing where his daughter's at and her friend.
The county boys showed up. They were telling us we needed to get away from the scene. What made me mad was they did not find Danny. We found Danny, we found Kathy, and I said, you better tell him he needs to stop and he needs to shut up. Yesterday was your day. Today, I'm in charge. So you can help us or you can get back. At that point, we decided that we were going to look through everything. Let's do the living room. Let's do the kitchen. Because Danny was here. The girls should be here too. And then you get back to the bedroom that the girls would have slept in. We didn't find them.
Lorene does, however, find something belonging to Laura among the ashes.
I found Laura's purse. She'd gotten her Christmas money, which she took with her because she was going to take Ashley and buy whatever Ashley wanted for her birthday.
Detectives discover the fire wasn't the cause of death for Danny and Kathy.
Investigators now say they were killed, each by a single gunshot wound.
Remains were taken to the medical examiner's office. They determined that Danny and Kathy had received a wound to the back of the head that was consistent with the shotgun blast and actually recovered some shotgun pellets. Now we've got a whole new mystery. What happened here? How come we're not finding Laura and Ashley? Where are they?
I knew there's no way. With her car still there and her purse in the house, Laura didn't leave there willingly. We did a grid search within a 10-mile radius of the Freeman property. We announced it over the radios. Anybody that would like to come out and help us, they were more than welcome.
Eager to find the missing girls, hundreds of people from Welch come out for the search.
I was a friend and a classmate to Laura and Ashley. We felt the need to just be there and to search and to look and to help. I remember it being colder and searching and walking and a song coming to my head, Way Beyond the Blue. I remember just thinking, keep singing this song and I'm going to find them. It's going to lead me to them. You know, you would do anything in that moment just to find them.
We have to find the girls because whoever killed Danny and Kathy could do anything to those two girls.
I can just remember all the people that were there that showed up for two young girls because they loved each other. They loved our community.
I mean, it was several miles. We had way over 100 volunteers show up. We had volunteers show up from other states.
And unfortunately, it did nothing. We didn't find anything that we were looking for.
After we did the grid search that day, the authorities showed up at the end of our search. And they took the girls from being missing to being abducted.
Now they know that they have a homicide. And now they're looking for the girls. A big crew of FBI agents actually started working on this case and looking for Laura and Ashley.
If you have any information about the crime or the missing girls, you are being asked to contact the Craig County Sheriff's Department in Veneta.
There's no sign of the missing girls, but two of the volunteers find something that could be important.
I'm standing behind the crime scene tape, and I'm approached by one of the neighbors and said there was two guys that wanted to see me, would like to talk to me. So I went over to them, and they introduced themselves as Joe Dugan and Tom Pryor. And they said they were private investigators. They knew a little bit of what was going on there. Tom immediately said, "We would like to help you and for you to be able to use our services. We would do this for $1. And that gives them the authority they need to act as private investigators in my behalf." I said, "You're hired." And he said, "Well, we just walking in the driveway here, we found something."
Joe bent over and picked up something about 50 feet up the driveway and said, "What's this?" I looked at it and I said, "It was insurance verification."
The name on the card was not Danny, Kathy, or Laura. As far as I knew, they didn't have connection to Danny and Kathy. At that point, anything you find like that has to be considered evidence. We got to find the girls. The insurance verification card could have led us to the girls and the person that committed the crime.
It was just after the murders. A very strong piece of evidence surfaced. An insurance card was found at the scene.
They asked me if I knew the name that was on the card, and I told them no, I did not recognize that at all.
The owner of the vehicle lived in Chitopa. They interviewed her on January 3rd, and she said, "I don't know why my insurance card was found at the scene."
The woman tells investigators she's not the only person who uses that car. Her boyfriend, Phil Welch, drives it too. The private investigators take the card to the authorities.
Joe presented the insurance verification card to the agent. His comment was, "What the hell makes you think that that insurance verification card has anything to do with this investigation?" And Tom Pryor says, "What the hell makes you think that it doesn't?" He just turned and walked away.
Adding to the difficulty of the investigation, a conflict between the Freeman family and the sheriff's office leads some to believe that detectives might drag their feet in solving the case.
This case has always been front and center with me. I've been a reporter for probably 25 years. The worst kept secret in Craig County was that the Freemans and the Craig County sheriffs were at odds. Everyone knew it.
Ashley had an older brother named Shane. Shane was almost 2 years older than Ashley.
He was burglarizing area houses, and he was running from the law. He was running from everyone.
He was spotted in the northwest corner of Craig County by a sheriff's deputy. He told Shane to get out of his truck. Shane did get out of the truck. The deputy ordered Shane to the ground 3 times on the loudspeaker. Shane never did go to the ground. Shane made an inappropriate movement, and the deputy shot. And Shane was killed.
Danny was obviously very grief-stricken. He lost his son. There was a lot of bad blood between the sheriff's department and the Freeman family. There was accusations that the sheriff's department was following Danny. There was accusations that Danny was making threats to some of the deputies. There was always that in the background, that it was related to the sheriff's office. The sheriff's department was accused of blotching this investigation.
Lorene Bible, meanwhile, is determined to find Laura and Ashley.
I'm going to find her, no matter what I have to do to find her.
We just couldn't sit still and do nothing. We made some posters that could go on the back of semis. Lorene and I drove hundreds of thousands of miles, putting their faces on every window that we could put them on.
This is what we want to do. We want to bring the community, anybody, anywhere together. We're going to do a chili stew, have people bring in items for auction, and we're going to do a fundraiser. The community rallied around these 2 families.
These small communities raised $50,000 for reward for locating the girls.
It amazed me the amount of people that did come out, and you can't repay that kind of kindness and dedication.
People in Welch continue to support the Bible and Freeman families. At the same time, many believe that Danny Freeman's alleged illegal activity is at the root of the case.
It was rumored that Danny grew marijuana, and he was a supplier. When I interviewed drug dealers, they said Danny grew the best pot in Northeast Oklahoma.
The rumors that were happening was that Danny owed a drug debt, but didn't pay the money to the people that he was supposed to, so they had called collecting the money. It was probably a year after the girls disappeared. One of the informants that had come forward to the FBI, he had called Jay and I, and he said he told them that we needed to go look over in the Miami area at the Mexican cartel. And I'm a mom, and I want to find my child, and I will do whatever it takes to find her. I sent word back through this person, I want to meet him. You tell him when he wants to see me, I'll be there. Then you get a phone call that states, you want to meet Mr. So-and-so, you be here, be in this area at this time. And then you get your dots in a row and you go and you meet. I have a mother-in-law, Jay's mom, Dixie, scared to death for us. And she's like, what if they shoot you? And I said, well, if they start shooting at me, I must be close.
Lorene met with the underbelly of society. She was fearless. She's remarkable. She's truly a remarkable woman.
Lorene Bible vowed to do anything to find her daughter, even if it means meeting with a ranking member of a drug cartel.
We go and we go to the place that we're going to meet, and it's pitch black. You turn off your light, and you wait for this vehicle. And I get out of the car, he gets out of his truck, and you meet. He said, how do you know I'm not packing? I said, how do you know I'm not packing? And at that point, he said, was you not scared to talk to me? And I said, nope.
I think that the fear of not knowing where her daughter is will always overcome fear of any other human causing her harm.
He just says, I hear you want to talk to me. And I said, I need to know if the girls were taken and if Danny was killed, because he owed you money. And he said, two things, ma'am. I don't kill women and I don't kill children. I believed him 100%.
Leads eventually dry up. Investigators have nothing new to tell the families. By Christmas of 2000, the case of the missing teenage girls goes as cold as the night they vanished. The families hold a memorial service for Laura and Ashley.
The first Christmas without her was hard. My aunt and uncle would not take the tree down, so the tree stayed up.
Because in your mind, she's coming home. So we weren't going to take the tree down till after she come home.
Nearly 5 years after the murders of the Freemans and the disappearance of Ashley and Laura, police in Mobile, Alabama, arrest someone with Oklahoma ties, the man named Jeremy Jones.
Jeremy Jones gets arrested in Mobile, Alabama on a charge of rape and murder of a woman named Lisa Nichols. He starts confessing to other crimes, other murders. a whole series of murders.
All told, Jones confesses to killing 13 people across 5 states.
On the 5-year anniversary of the girl's disappearance, there was a candlelight vigil. I got a phone call from the authorities and said Jeremy Jones confessed to the Welch girl's murder and disappearance.
And Jeremy gives enough details to make him a viable suspect.
He had a long driveway, dirt roads. He's in the country. Was just looking for mailboxes that said Freeman on or something.
And he gave the motive of killing Danny and Kathy was because Danny owed a drug dealer in Miami, Oklahoma, a lot of money.
2 people in the bedroom, 2 shots.
Where were the bodies located, the best you can remember?
One in the bed, one out of the bed.
Weeks later, investigators traveled to Alabama to speak directly with Jones.
He alleges that after he killed Danny and Kathy, he set fire to the residence, and Ashley and Laura come running out of the residence. He says he takes them to an area near Galena, Kansas, kills them, and throws them down a mine shaft. There was a big search. They did locate the mine shaft, but they didn't find any evidence of the girls being in that mine shaft.
Then Jones takes it all back, claiming he wasn't involved.
It's hard to get in someone's head like this. Why did he confess to something that he did or didn't do? You don't know.
Never did I think Jeremy Jones did it. There would have been a group of people that had to take those girls off that property.
In October 2005, Jones is convicted for the murder of Lisa Nichols, but investigators can't connect him to Laura and Ashley's abduction or the murders. Once again, the case goes cold.
It was a long time before I was really to a point to accept the fact that they probably were not alive anymore. Sorry. Sometimes it just comes out of nowhere.
After the Jeremy Jones, you're waiting for the next tip, the next time somebody says something, then it gets real quiet again. After 8, 9, 10 years, the tree was so heavy, it fell over and broke. At that point, I couldn't put up a tree because Laura was always the one that put up our tree.
I knew the case had grown cold. So I contacted my boss and I said, I would love to look at this case. He said, yes. So in 2011, I actually started working, and the case file was so huge. I had to go back and read this thing 2 or 3 times. So many names and so much information. It's just mind-boggling. Surely in all of this information, the suspect is in these reports somewhere, somehow. The fact that we have 2 16-year-old girls missing, and I have kids, it affects me personally.
Determined to crack the case, Stansel wants justice for the missing girls and Kathy and Danny Freeman. In 2013, he joins forces with the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation, hoping to thaw this ice-cold case.
So me and Gary actually got together and decided that we were going to work the case together. We got approval on that.
Stansel and Ferrari re-interview witnesses from the initial investigation, and one name comes up over and over.
So there was an individual by the name of Phil Welch.
Initially, when I started reading through that case file, there was a talk about an insurance card that was located at the scene. And so this insurance card had a female's name on it. She was interviewed early on, and she had talked about her boyfriend, which was Phil Welch, did know the Freemans, and he often drove her car.
The case file shows that detectives had questioned Welch after that insurance card was found.
Whenever they did talk to Phil Welch, he had brought up the name of David Pennington, talked about David being a friend of his, talked about David cooking meth, David was a kingpin, and then Ronnie Busick's name's coming up. And these three ran together. They were from the Chautauqua area, and they were known to smoke meth, they were known to make meth, they were known to sell meth.
There were some reports in regards to those people. There are individuals that had actually been interviewed that said these people were involved.
For some reason, though, it seems no one followed up on those leads.
There was so much information coming in at one time. One of the reports was done by FBI, and another one, I think, was done by KBI. And so I think they just got overlooked at the time.
So we wanted to go back, and I wanted to interview those individuals that gave that information. But we couldn't find the people to re-interview to corroborate their statements.
Investigators search for connections between the alleged meth dealers and the murders and abductions. Laureen Bible, meanwhile, searches for Laura and Ashley.
My niece, Lisa, had a friend say, hey, social media is up and running now. You guys need to have the website so that people can send you tips. So she helped my niece get the website up and running, and that's when we started getting tips.
We received a tip from someone who knew someone who heard something. We were told that there were pictures of the girls bound and gagged, Polaroids of them that had been taken, that they were being held against their will, and other things had happened.
Rumor had it there was pictures of them and this was done to them. You don't really focus on that part, because if you do, then you'll stop.
To find out whether these pictures exist, Stansel tracks down one of David Pennington's ex-girlfriends, who was identified by the tipster.
I get information about a woman who actually lived with David Pennington and found out where she lived and went to interview her. I said, do you ever hear them talk about anything about these missing girls? And she said, yes. I overheard them talking about their involvement with the missing girls, and that they actually insinuated that they had molested them. Then she makes a statement to me that I didn't ask, but she volunteered the statement.
The other guy used to brag that he took pictures of girls tied up. I guess all three of them, molested them.
A few months later, I interviewed Phil Welch's second girlfriend at the time.
And when we asked about details of these pictures, they were without a doubt believed that it was Laura and Ashley. They said that the girls in the pictures, they were bound, they were gagged. One of our witnesses was able to tell us that she saw a bedspread that she knew because she dated Phil. She was able to tell us then, without a doubt, that that was Phil's house where she saw the girls. So we start looking at the three of them. We find out that Phil Welch is already deceased. David Pennington is deceased. But Ronnie Busick, we found out that he was still alive. People told us that he was pure evil, that he was the devil. There was people that were just terrified of him.
Most people, they say, how do you get the courage to continue, go on? It's because I don't want to be a parent and not know where my child is. I have to do something every day so I know at least I'm looking.
We started digging through the files, and we started seeing the names of Phil Welch, Ronnie Busick, David Pennington. Our other two suspects are deceased. We knew we needed to go talk to Ronnie Busick.
Stansel and Ferrari head to a Kansas jail to interview Ronnie Busick, who's incarcerated on a separate charge. Busick might be their last hope of finally solving this case.
Kind of just kept it casual at first.
Do you know a guy by the name of Phil Welch?
That name sounds familiar.
And then the more that we talked to him, then it was, yeah, I used to hang out with him. I used to cook meth with him.
We did other interviews with him. He still wouldn't give us information.
I knew what happened to him. I'd let you guys know, but I don't.
We finally decided there was sufficient information to file charges on Ronnie Busick. So we put together a very lengthy arrest affidavit. The day he would walk out of the Kansas jail, we walked into the jail with our arrest warrant from Oklahoma, which effectively put a hold on Ronnie Busick to keep him in jail.
Detectives charge Busick with 2 counts of kidnapping and 4 counts of murder.
On the day that we went to Kansas, it was during that interview that finally Busick made some admissions. He said, well, if I was there, I would have stayed in the car. Okay, fine. Tell me what happened. Well, we went there to collect the drug debt.
During several interviews, Busick gives investigators his version of what happened on that frigid December night in 1999.
So, from everything that we can understand, David, Phil, and Ronnie went out there to Danny and Kathy's house. Danny is ultimately shot during this, and then Kathy is shot. The girls end up escaping out of another door and run to the back of the house, and they're hiding. Once the suspects see them, the suspects ended up catching them. They were taken to Phil Welch's house in Pitcher, Oklahoma, and ended up being kept there for 2 weeks, where they were tortured, they were drugged, and then ultimately killed and disposed of.
Busick claims he stayed in the car, while Welch and Pennington went inside the house.
The family agreed that we would offer Ronnie Busick immunity if he provides us the location of the girls.
Finally, with the trial looming, Ronnie Busick pleads guilty to his part in these awful crimes. Prosecutors agree to drop the original charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping if Busick will agree to help find the girls.
He's given us some places to go and check. He's told us, you might check a root cellar. Took him out there, okay, show us the area. We did a dig out there, and we didn't find anything.
On August 31st, 2020, a judge sentences Ronnie Busick to 10 years in prison and 5 years of probation for accessory to murder. Neither Laura Bible or Ashley Freeman have been found. The search for them goes on.
We received a tip from relatives of David Pennington. They remember there being some sort of cellar on the property that they were forbidden to go near. And we just felt like it was good information that needed to be checked out. We just really had hoped that there would be something there, and there just wasn't.
You have to go back and think about that opportunity that was missed. It was on January 3rd, 4 days after the murders. Phil Welch's name surfaced. I think maybe the authorities could have found the girls with that early lead.
I had dreams of it being her wedding day, and I was standing at the front of the church, watching her walk down the aisle. And when her dad lifted her veil, she had no face. I think having part of the truth kind of helps to know, but we still don't have that closure.
We have a memorial set up at Pitzer where the trailer was that the girls were held into. We've turned it into a memorial site. But that's not who she was. She was more than just a girl that was abducted, murdered, tortured. She was more than that. I have 3 grandchildren now, and they all say, "Nana, well, you have no tree." According to my granddaughter, she's going to help put up the tree. And she wants to put her daddy's and her Aunt Laura's tree ornaments on the tree. She told me, "I will do it. I will help you."
On a warm Friday morning in June 1980, the small community of Wiley, Texas, appeared to be what its residents believed it was: quiet, familiar, and safe. Families knew one another. Children moved between homes. Neighbors attended the same churches, and private lives seemed to unfold behind ordinary suburban doors. Nothing about the street suggested that before the day was over, one woman would be dead inside her own home, and another would become the center of one of the most controversial murder cases in Texas history. The woman at the center of that story was Candy Montgomery. To people who knew her, Candy did not look like someone capable of committing a brutal killing. She was married, had children, participated in church activities, and lived a kind of organized suburban life that appeared reassuringly ordinary. She was part of a close religious community where friendships often extended beyond Sunday services. That community also included Betty Gore, another married woman with children, whose life seemed similarly conventional. Candy and Betty knew each other through church and their social circle. They were not strangers brought together by chance. They belonged to the same world, shared acquaintances, and moved through the same network of families. That familiarity would later make the crime even more disturbing. The killer, investigators would discover, had not been an unknown intruder who suddenly entered Betty's home. The conflict had grown inside a community where people believed they knew one another. Behind the appearance of stability, however, Candy had become involved with Betty's husband, Alan Gore. The affair was secret, complicated, and personal. Candy and Alan eventually decided to end their relationship. Alan returned to his marriage and attempted to rebuild his relationship with Betty. From the outside, the affair appeared to be over. The two families continued their separate lives, and there was every reason to believe the painful episode might eventually become something buried in the past. But secrets rarely disappear simply because the people involved agreed to stop discussing them. On June 13, 1980, Alan Gore left home for work. Betty remained at the house with her children. Later that day, Candy went to Betty's home. The reason for the visit would become one of the most important questions in the investigation, because what happened inside the house could be reconstructed only through Candy's account and the physical evidence left behind. According to Candy's later statement, she and Betty confronted each other about the affair. The conversation became an argument. The emotions surrounding Alan, betrayal, marriage, and trust suddenly moved from the realm of secrets into a direct confrontation between the two women. Candy said Betty became angry and that Betty was holding an axe. She claimed that Betty threatened her and that the situation quickly became physical. Candy maintained that she was fighting for her life. In her version of events, the violence was not planned. It was a desperate struggle that escalated beyond anything either woman could control. But whatever happened in those crucial moments, the confrontation ended with Betty Gore dead. The weapon was an axe. The violence was extraordinary. Betty had suffered 41 blows, or wounds associated with the axe attack. The sheer number became one of the most disturbing details of the case, and later became central to debate over Candy's claim of self-defense. How could a confrontation that began as an argument produce such a devastating attack? Was Candy describing a genuine struggle for survival, or was the violence evidence of something more deliberate? Those questions would not be answered at the scene. Instead, the house became a crime scene, and investigators began working backward through the relationships of the people involved. Betty's death did not immediately fit the image of a random home invasion. There was a personal history behind it, and investigators soon learned about Candy and Alan. Meanwhile, Alan was unaware of what had happened. After leaving for work, he eventually became concerned when he could not reach Betty. Calls went unanswered. The rhythm of the day had changed without his knowing why. When concern turned into alarm, people went to check on the house. Inside, the truth was impossible to ignore. Betty was dead. The peaceful image of Wiley had been shattered inside a family home, and an investigation was about to expose a story involving friendship, marriage, secrecy, and violence. For the residents who knew Candy and Betty, the news was difficult to comprehend. These were not distant figures from a dangerous part of town. They were familiar faces from church and the neighborhood. Betty had been a wife and mother. Candy was someone people had known socially. The idea that an argument between two women from the same community could end in a killing seemed almost impossible. Yet the physical evidence left investigators with no choice but to confront the brutality of what had happened. As detectives examined the circumstances, Candy's connection to Alan became impossible to separate from the case. Her relationship with Betty's husband provided a possible motive, but motive alone could not explain the entire crime. Candy admitted the affair and did not deny being at the house. Her defense would depend on something more specific, what she believed was happening in the final moments before Betty died. That distinction would eventually determine everything. If Candy had deliberately attacked Betty, the killing could be understood as a murder born from jealousy, anger, or resentment. If Candy had genuinely been attacked first and responded to protect herself, the legal meaning of the same physical confrontation could be completely different. The question was no longer simply who had killed Betty Gore. The question was what had happened between the first angry words and the final blow. And somewhere inside that narrow, terrifying gap between an argument and a death was a truth that would eventually send Candy Montgomery into a courtroom, where 12 strangers would decide whether she was a murderer or a woman who had survived a deadly confrontation. The discovery of Betty Gore's body transformed an ordinary Friday in Wiley into a mystery that investigators would spend weeks trying to understand. At first, the facts seemed brutally simple. Betty was dead inside her home, and an axe had been used in the attack. But the closer detectives looked, the less the case resembled a random act of violence. There was no obvious stranger who could explain what had happened. Instead, the investigation began pointing towards someone who already belonged to Betty's world. Candy Montgomery was quickly drawn into the center of attention. She had been at Betty's house that day, and she had a complicated history with Betty's husband, Alan. That history could not be ignored. Candy and Alan had once carried on an affair, a secret relationship that had eventually ended. Alan and Betty had then attempted to repair their marriage, creating the appearance that the dangerous chapter had closed. Yet on the day Betty died, the past returned with devastating consequences. Investigators needed to determine exactly when Candy arrived, why she came, what was said between the women, and how the confrontation escalated. Those questions mattered because Candy did not deny being present. Her defense depended on what happened after the argument began. She maintained that Betty confronted her angrily and that Betty was holding an axe. Candy said the weapon became part of a struggle and that she eventually seized it. From that point, according to Candy, she was fighting to survive. The physical evidence presented investigators with a disturbing problem. Betty had suffered 41 blows, or wounds during the attack. The number was difficult to reconcile with the idea of a brief defensive reaction. Each injury raised another question about the sequence of events. How long had the confrontation lasted? Had Betty remained capable of fighting after the first strike? At what point did Candy understand that the danger had changed? And when did the struggle become a fatal attack? There were no independent eyewitnesses inside the house to provide simple answers. The investigators therefore had to examine the scene, reconstruct the movements of the two women, and compare the physical evidence with Candy's account. Every detail mattered. The position of objects, the condition of the rooms, and the injuries themselves could potentially reveal whether the encounter had been a planned attack or a chaotic struggle. The murder also carried an obvious emotional dimension. Candy had been involved with Alan, and Betty was his wife. Even if the affair had ended, the knowledge of it could have left resentment and distrust behind. Investigators had to consider whether jealousy or anger had motivated Candy to confront Betty. At the same time, they had to determine whether Betty had initiated the physical confrontation, as Candy claimed. Alan's movements became important as well. He had been away from the house when the killing occurred, leaving Betty alone with the children. When he later realized that something was wrong, the normal routine of the family had already been destroyed. The tragedy was not discovered immediately by a witness who could describe the final moments. Instead, the truth emerged only after the people outside the house began to realize that Betty was unreachable. As detectives continued their work, Candy's behavior after the killing became another part of the investigation. If she had deliberately murdered Betty, prosecutors could argue that her actions reflected a conscious decision. If she had truly experienced a sudden and terrifying attack, her behavior could be interpreted very differently. The distinction between intention and survival would eventually become the heart of the legal battle. The case soon became larger than the question of an affair. It raised difficult questions about self-defense and the limits of human reaction under extreme fear. Texas law allowed people to defend themselves against serious threats, but a jury would have to decide whether Candy's actions fit within that principle. The number of injuries inflicted on Betty made the issue especially difficult. For the people of Wiley, the investigation was deeply unsettling because Candy and Betty had not lived in separate worlds. They had shared a community. They had attended church. Their families had known one another. The tragedy therefore felt personal to people who had expected their town to be protected from the kind of violence usually associated with distant places and strangers. Rumors began to circulate, as they often do when a shocking crime enters a small community. Some people viewed Candy with suspicion because of her relationship with Alan. Others struggled to believe that a woman they knew socially could deliberately commit such a brutal killing. The facts were disturbing, but the unanswered questions were even more disturbing. Candy's account remained central. She said she had not gone to Betty's home intending to kill her. She said the confrontation had become physical and that she had reacted to an attack. Her explanation required investigators, and eventually a jury, to accept that the extraordinary violence was a result of a rapidly escalating struggle rather than a carefully planned murder. But the prosecution would not simply accept that explanation. A person had died, and the circumstances demanded scrutiny. The 41 injuries became a symbol of the case, challenging the idea that the killing could be dismissed as one desperate moment. The prosecution would have to show that Candy's conduct crossed a legal boundary between self-defense and murder. Yet one critical mystery remained unresolved. What exactly happened inside Betty Gore's home during those final minutes? Candy had her version. The physical evidence had its own story. Investigators would spend considerable effort trying to connect the two. The answer would eventually emerge in a courtroom, but before that could happen, prosecutors and defense attorneys would have to examine Candy's state of mind. Why had the encounter become so violent? Could fear explain the extraordinary number of blows? Or did the evidence reveal anger and intention? The future of Candy Montgomery would depend on how 12 jurors answered those questions. And as the case moved toward trial, Wiley was about to witness a courtroom battle unlike anything its quiet community had experienced before, increasingly tense. As investigators continued examining Betty Gore's death, the central mystery became increasingly personal. The evidence pointed toward a relationship that had been hidden from much of the community, yet its consequences had become impossible to conceal. Candy Montgomery and Alan Gore had been involved in an affair, and although they had ended it, the emotional damage remained. Betty had every reason to know that her marriage had been threatened. Candy had every reason to understand that her friendship with Betty could never be completely ordinary again. The affair had begun months before the killing. Candy and Alan had discussed their attraction and eventually crossed a boundary that neither could undo. Their relationship was not simply a secret romantic encounter. It created tension inside two marriages and introduced the possibility of consequences that both families would eventually face. Candy later maintained that she and Alan had tried to approach the affair rationally. They recognized the danger and decided that continuing would be destructive. Alan returned to Betty, and Candy returned to her own family. To outsiders, the situation appeared resolved. But Betty was left with the knowledge that another woman had become involved with her husband. That knowledge mattered that day. When Candy arrived at Betty's home, the two women were not meeting as strangers. They carried a history with them. Their conversation was shaped by everything that had happened before, even if neither could have imagined how quickly the encounter would become deadly. Candy's account described Betty as angry and threatening. She said Betty confronted her about Alan, and that the argument became physical. According to Candy, Betty picked up an axe and threatened her. Candy said she became frightened and eventually gained control of the weapon. The sequence remained disputed, but the result was undisputed. Betty died inside her home. For investigators, the most difficult part was understanding Candy's state of mind. A claim of self-defense does not depend on whether someone was afraid. It depends on whether the person reasonably believed force was necessary to protect herself from an immediate threat. The circumstances surrounding that belief, therefore, became crucial. The number of injuries complicated everything. 41 blows associated with an axe attack created an image of extraordinary violence. To many people, the number seemed incompatible with self-defense. Yet the defense would later argue that human behavior during extreme fear does not always follow logic. A person experiencing overwhelming panic may continue reacting even after the immediate danger has changed. This idea will become one of the most important elements of Candy's defense. Before the trial, however, investigators had to establish as much of the timeline as possible. They examined the home, interviewed people who knew the women, and explored Candy's relationship with Alan. Every conversation potentially revealed another piece of the story. The children also became part of the tragic background. Betty was not simply a victim in an isolated crime. She was a mother whose sudden death left her family permanently changed. The fact that her children were connected to home made the crime even more painful for those who knew the family. Meanwhile, Candy faced a future she could not predict. If prosecutors convinced a jury that she had intentionally killed Betty, she could spend years in prison. If the jury accepted her account, the consequences would be dramatically different. The community was divided by uncertainty. Some people saw the affair as an obvious motive. They believed anger, jealousy, or resentment could have driven Candy to attack Betty. Others wondered whether the circumstances might genuinely have been different from what they appeared. The case also raised an uncomfortable question about friendship. Candy and Betty had shared the same social environment, yet their relationship had become complicated by Alan. What looked like an ordinary suburban friendship had been transformed by secrecy. The people around them had not necessarily seen the conflict developing beneath the surface. As investigators prepared the case, the affair became impossible to separate from the killing. It explained why Candy had been at Betty's house, why the two women might have confronted each other, and why emotions could have been intense. But it did not automatically prove murder. That distinction would become the foundation of the defense. Candy did not need to convince everyone that the killing had never happened. Betty was dead, and Candy acknowledged being involved in the confrontation. Instead, she needed to establish that the circumstances surrounding the killing supported her claim that she had acted to protect herself. The prosecution faced the opposite challenge. It had to show that Candy's conduct was not legally justified. The extraordinary number of wounds offered powerful emotional evidence, but emotion alone could not determine guilt. The jury would have to examine the entire confrontation, including what Candy believed at the time. That meant the trial would become a battle over human psychology as much as physical evidence. What happens when fear takes control? Can a person continue using force after the original threat has changed? Can an act that appears unbelievably violent from the outside still be the product of panic? Those questions were difficult because there was no recording of the confrontation and no independent witness who could provide an account. The jury would ultimately have to reconstruct the final moments from evidence, testimony, and competing interpretations. The case was therefore moving toward a courtroom where the past affair would be exposed, the violence would be examined in detail, and Candy's mental state would become a central issue. But one thing remained clear. Whatever happened inside Betty Gore's home began with two women who knew each other and a secret that had already damaged both families. By the time the investigation was complete, that secret would no longer belong to Candy, Alan, and Betty alone. It would become a foundation of a murder trial that would captivate Texas and leave one question hanging over everything. Was Candy Montgomery a calculating killer, or had she truly believed that Betty Gore was about to kill her? By the time Candy Montgomery's case reached the courtroom, the quiet community of Wiley had already been forced to confront a story that seemed impossible to reconcile. Betty Gore was dead, killed inside her own home with an axe, and Candy, a woman who had known her through church and social circles, admitted that she had been present during the fatal confrontation. The central dispute was no longer whether Candy had been involved. It was whether she had committed murder or had acted in self-defense. The prosecution faced an emotionally powerful case. Betty had suffered 41 blows during the attack, a detail that could not easily be forgotten. To prosecutors, the violence suggested something far more deliberate than a momentary defensive response. They pointed toward the history between the two women and the affair involving Alan Gore. Candy had been involved with Betty's husband, and Betty knew about that relationship. The circumstances created an obvious motive for anger and resentment. But motive was not enough. The prosecution needed to convince the jury that Candy had intentionally or knowingly committed an unlawful killing. The defense therefore focused heavily on the circumstances inside the house and on Candy's mental state during the confrontation. Candy's account remained consistent in its essential claim. She said Betty confronted her about the affair and became angry. According to Candy, Betty picked up an axe and threatened her. Candy said she became frightened, and the struggle that followed was not something she had planned. She described the encounter as a fight for survival. The defense had to make the jury understand what it meant for someone to believe that death was imminent. They argued that Candy's actions could not be judged simply by looking at the final result. Betty was dead, and the attack had been extraordinarily violent, but the legal question concerned what Candy believed while the confrontation was happening. That distinction became crucial. A person standing outside a violent event can look at the result and see a series of terrible decisions. Someone inside the confrontation may experience something entirely different. Fear can narrow perception. Adrenaline can overwhelm judgment. A person may react instinctively rather than calmly calculating every movement. The defense argued that this was what had happened to Candy. The prosecution challenged that interpretation. 41 blows were not easy to explain. If Candy had successfully gained control of the axe, why did the attack continue? If Betty was already incapacitated, what caused Candy to keep striking? Those questions were among the most difficult issues the jury had to consider. The prosecution could use a number of wounds to suggest that Candy had crossed the boundary of self-defense. The defense, however, attempted to place the violence inside the psychological reality of the confrontation. They argued that Candy had entered a state of extreme emotional disturbance, and that the number of blows did not necessarily prove that she had begun the encounter intending to kill. The courtroom therefore became a place where physical evidence and psychology collided. Candy's relationship with Alan was examined closely because it provided the background to the confrontation. The affair had created a hidden connection between Candy and Alan that placed Betty in an extraordinarily painful position. Yet the fact that Candy had been involved with Alan did not automatically establish that she wanted Betty dead. That distinction mattered because the jury had to decide the case on evidence rather than moral judgment. Candy could be criticized for the affair, but being unfaithful was not the same as committing murder. The question was whether the affair had transformed into a motive for violence on June 13th. The defense understood that the jury would naturally struggle with the emotional side of the case. Betty was a wife and mother who had died violently. Candy had been connected to her through the same community and had also been romantically involved with Betty's husband. It was easy to imagine resentment. It was much harder to imagine a jury accepting that the killing had been purely defensive. That is why Candy's mental state became so important. The defense presented psychological testimony intended to explain the unusual behavior associated with the attack. The argument was that Candy experienced an intense psychological response during the confrontation, something that affected her ability to control herself. The defense did not need to argue that the attack was normal. Instead, they needed to explain how a woman who had not planned a killing could nevertheless become responsible for an extraordinary amount of violence. This strategy created an unusual courtroom dynamic. Jurors were not simply asked to decide whether Candy had used an axe. Everyone knew that she had. They were asked to understand the difference between an intentional killing and a killing committed during a terrifying struggle. The prosecution attempted to keep the jury focused on the physical reality of Betty's death. 41 blows were not a minor detail. They were evidence of severity of the attack, and potentially evidence of intent. The defense attempted to shift the focus toward the moments immediately before the violence began. What happened first? Who held the axe? Who threatened whom? How did the weapon change hands? What was Candy thinking at the moment she began striking? Those questions could not be answered with absolute certainty because Betty was unable to provide her own account. Her death meant that the jury had to reconstruct the confrontation largely from Candy's testimony and the physical evidence. That created an extraordinary legal problem. The person who could have contradicted Candy most directly was no longer alive. Candy's credibility, therefore, became critically important. If jurors believed her account, they could view the killing through the lens of self-defense. If they rejected it, the same evidence could look like a brutal murder motivated by personal conflict. The courtroom heard about the affair, the confrontation, and the killing. The private life of a suburban community became public evidence. Details that might once have remained inside marriages and friendships were now discussed openly before strangers. For people in Wiley, the case was difficult to watch because it challenged assumptions about the people living around them. Candy did not fit the stereotypical image of a violent criminal. She was a mother and a member of a church community. Betty had also lived an ordinary life before the attack. Neither woman appeared to belong to a world where an axe murder could suddenly occur. Yet the courtroom was dealing with exactly that reality. The prosecution had the burden of proving guilt. The defense needed to establish enough uncertainty about Candy's state of mind and claim of self-defense to prevent a conviction. This meant that the final decision would depend not simply on what had happened, but on whether the evidence eliminated reasonable doubt. As the trial progressed, the competing stories became increasingly clear. The prosecution presented Candy as a woman whose secret relationship with Alan had created a dangerous emotional conflict. The defense presented her as a woman who had entered a confrontation and suddenly found herself fighting for her life. Both versions contained elements that were difficult to ignore. There had been an affair. There had been an argument. There had been an axe. There had been 41 blows. And Betty Gore had died. The question was how those facts should be interpreted. For the jury, the case required more than sympathy. Betty's death demanded justice, but justice required determining whether Candy's actions met the legal definition of murder. The jurors had to separate their emotional reaction to the affair and the violence from the specific legal question before them. Candy sat in the courtroom, knowing that the decision would determine the rest of her life. If convicted, she could face a long prison sentence and become permanently defined by Betty's death. If acquitted, she would walk away from the courtroom legally innocent of murder, even though the killing itself would remain attached to her name forever. Outside the courtroom, people continued debating what they believed had happened. Inside, the jurors listened. The prosecution had presented a brutal killing and a possible motive. The defense had presented a frightened woman claiming that she had fought for survival. The physical evidence was horrifying, but the legal meaning of that evidence remained contested. Eventually, the arguments would end. The jurors would leave the courtroom and begin the most important discussion of the case. They would have to decide whether Candy Montgomery had deliberately killed Betty Gore, or whether the law should accept her explanation that she had acted in self-defense. Whatever decision they reached, the result would become the most shocking chapter of the entire case. The courtroom became almost unbearably tense as the final arguments in Candy Montgomery's trial came to an end. For days, the jury had heard about a secret affair, a broken friendship, an explosive confrontation, and a killing so violent that the number of wounds had become one of the defining facts of the case. Now the jurors had to decide what those facts meant. Betty Gore was dead. Candy Montgomery had admitted being present during the confrontation. An axe had been used. 41 blows had been inflicted. Yet the legal question was not simply whether Candy had caused Betty's death. The jury had to determine whether the killing was murder or whether Candy had acted in self-defense. That distinction would determine everything. The prosecution had attempted to construct a clear narrative. Candy had been involved with Alan Gore, Betty's husband. The affair had threatened Betty's marriage and created a deep personal conflict. On the day of the killing, Candy went to Betty's home, and the two women confronted one another. The violence that followed was extreme. From the prosecution's perspective, the circumstances suggested that anger and resentment had transformed into deadly violence. The defense offered a very different interpretation. Candy had not gone to the house intending to kill Betty. They argued she had gone into a confrontation that quickly became dangerous. Betty, according to Candy's account, had threatened her with an axe. Candy believed she was in immediate danger and reacted instinctively. What happened afterward was not a carefully planned attack, but an eruption of fear and violence. The defense also emphasized a psychological explanation surrounding Candy's behavior. The argument was not that 41 blows were ordinary or reasonable under normal circumstances. Instead, the defense sought to explain how a person could enter an extreme state of fear and continue reacting violently after the confrontation had escalated. For the jury, that argument presented an enormous challenge. People tend to imagine self-defense as something simple. Someone attacks, the victim fights back, the threat ends, and the defensive response stops. But real confrontations can be chaotic. People can panic. Perception can become distorted. Physical movement can happen faster than conscious thought. The defense wanted the jurors to consider that possibility. The prosecution wanted them to consider something else. They wanted the jury to look at the number of wounds and ask whether such extraordinary violence could truly be described as self-defense. That question hung over the courtroom. The final arguments gave both sides one last opportunity to shape the jury's understanding of the evidence. The prosecution emphasized Betty's death and the brutality of the attack. The defense emphasized the circumstances that led to the violence, and Candy's claim that she feared for her life. Then the lawyers stopped talking. The evidence had been presented. The witnesses had testified. The arguments were finished. The jury withdrew to deliberate. For Candy Montgomery, the weight must have been filled with uncertainty. Her entire future was now in the hands of strangers. A conviction could mean years in prison. An acquittal would mean freedom, but it would not erase the fact that Betty Gore had died. For Betty's family, there was another kind of uncertainty. Whatever the verdict, Betty would not return home. Her children would grow up without their mother. Her marriage and family had been permanently altered. A legal verdict could decide Candy's fate, but it could never repair the damage caused by Betty's death. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to provoke strong reactions. People struggled to understand how a woman could inflict such extraordinary violence and still claim self-defense. Others believed that the prosecution had not adequately disproved Candy's account. The same evidence produced radically different interpretations depending on how people understood the confrontation. That was the central tension of the case. The jury did not have to decide whether Candy was a good person. They did not have to decide whether her affair with Alan was morally acceptable. They did not have to decide whether Betty had been treated fairly during the breakdown of her marriage. They had to decide whether Candy was guilty of murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Those questions were narrower than the emotional stories surrounding them, but they were also more difficult. Eventually, the jurors returned. The courtroom waited for the verdict. Candy Montgomery stood before them knowing that the next words could determine the rest of her life. The verdict was read, not guilty. For many people, the decision was astonishing. Candy Montgomery would not go to prison for Betty Gore's death. The jury had accepted, or at least found sufficient doubt surrounding, Candy's claim that she had acted in self-defense. The prosecution had failed to prove the case to the required legal standard. In an instant, the future changed. Candy was free. The result was particularly shocking because of the violence involved. 41 blows had been associated with the killing, yet the woman responsible for the attack, according to the undisputed facts of her own involvement, had been acquitted. For those who believed Candy had murdered Betty deliberately, the verdict was difficult to understand. They saw the affair, the confrontation, and the extraordinary number of injuries as evidence of a killing that should have resulted in punishment. For those who accepted the defense, the verdict represented the legal principle that a person cannot be convicted of murder when the evidence leaves a reasonable doubt about whether she was acting to protect herself. The courtroom had answered the legal question. But the public argument did not end. Candy's acquittal became the most memorable part of the entire case. It transformed the story from a tragic murder into a national discussion about self-defense, psychology, marital betrayal, and the way juries interpret violence. People continued asking whether the number of blows should have mattered more. They asked whether Candy's fear was believable. They asked whether the affair created a motive for murder. They asked whether Betty had really attacked first. And perhaps most importantly, they asked whether anyone could ever know exactly what happened during those final moments. Betty was not there to tell her side. That absence would forever remain part of the mystery. Candy had survived the confrontation and had the opportunity to describe it. Betty could never provide her own version. The jury therefore had to make its decision using the evidence available to them, knowing that one of the two women involved could never speak again. After the acquittal, Candy attempted to move forward with her life. But freedom did not mean the story disappeared. Her name remained connected to Betty Gore and the axe killing in Wiley. The case continued to attract attention because it contained so many elements that seemed almost impossible to reconcile. A suburban church community, two women who knew each other, a secret affair, a confrontation inside an ordinary home, a brutal axe attack, a murder investigation, a courtroom battle over self-defense, and finally an acquittal. The contrast between the setting and the violence made the case especially haunting. Nothing about Wiley seemed to prepare anyone for such a crime. The tragedy did not unfold in an isolated wilderness or a dangerous neighborhood. It happened behind the walls of a normal family home, involving people who had shared the same community. That was perhaps why the case remained so powerful. It demonstrated how little the appearance of normality can reveal about what is happening beneath the surface. Candy and Betty had lived within the same social world. Their families had interacted. Their lives had followed familiar suburban routines. Yet behind that normality was a secret relationship that had created wounds neither woman could simply ignore. On June 13, 1980, those wounds became physical. Betty lost her life. Candy lost her place in the community and became permanently associated with one of Texas's most controversial killings. And the courtroom delivered a verdict that left many people asking whether justice had truly been served. Legally, the answer is clear. Candy Montgomery was not guilty, but emotionally, morally, and historically, the case remained unresolved in the minds of countless people who encountered the story. The verdict closed the criminal case, but it did not close a mystery, because the question that survived the trial was the same question that had haunted investigators from the beginning. What really happened inside Betty Gore's house? Candy had given her answer. The jury had accepted it, but Betty could never give hers. The verdict ended the criminal trial, but it did not end the story of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore. In many ways, the most enduring part of the case began after the courtroom doors closed. Candy was free, yet the circumstances surrounding Betty's death remained disturbing, complicated, and impossible for the people of Wiley to forget. The law had reached a conclusion, but public opinion had not. Candy Montgomery's acquittal rested on the jury's acceptance of her claim of self-defense, or at least on the existence of enough reasonable doubt to prevent a murder conviction. That distinction was fundamental. An acquittal did not mean the jury had declared every detail of Candy's story proven beyond question. It meant the prosecution had not met the burden required for a guilty verdict. Yet outside the courtroom, people often reduce that complicated legal decision to a single shocking phrase: not guilty. For those who believed Candy had deliberately killed Betty, the verdict felt impossible. They looked at the 41 blows and saw evidence of uncontrolled anger or purposeful violence. They looked at the affair with Alan Gore and saw a motive rooted in jealousy, betrayal, and resentment. To them, the idea that Candy had simply fought for her life was difficult to accept. Others saw a different picture. They believed that a confrontation could become chaotic in seconds, and that fear could produce behavior that seemed irrational afterward. If Betty had truly threatened Candy with an axe, then the question was not how the final scene looked to an observer, but what Candy believed was happening while she was inside the confrontation. That was the legal and psychological foundation of the defense. The disagreement never disappeared. For Betty's family, the verdict could not change the most important fact. Betty was gone, No legal explanation could restore her place at home or return her to her children. Her death had transformed an ordinary household into a permanent reminder of tragedy. The children were left with a history they could never escape. The case would become part of their lives because their mother had died in circumstances that attracted extraordinary attention. Alan Gore also had to live with the consequences. His relationship with Candy had ended long before the courtroom verdict, but the affair had become permanently connected to Betty's death. The private decisions of two adults had become public evidence in a murder trial. The emotional consequences extended far beyond the people who had originally made those choices. The case also changed how many people viewed their community. Wiley had seemed ordinary and predictable. Church relationships, family gatherings, friendships, and suburban routines had created an impression of security. The killing demonstrated how little appearances could reveal about private conflicts. That contrast became one of the reasons the case remained memorable. There was no mysterious stranger emerging from a dark road. There was no unknown criminal traveling through town. The central figures belonged to the same social environment. The danger had developed within relationships that looked familiar from the outside. Years later, the case continued to attract attention because it raised questions that extended beyond Candy and Betty. How should a jury evaluate self-defense when the person claiming it has inflicted extreme violence? How should psychological evidence influence the understanding of a violent confrontation? Can a person be morally responsible for a death while still being legally justified in causing it? And what happens when the only surviving participant provides a primary account of what occurred? These questions do not have easy answers. The Candy Montgomery case became especially influential because its central contradiction was so striking. The killing was horrifying, but the legal outcome was an acquittal. The victim and defendant had known each other, yet the violence was sudden and intimate. The alleged motive was personal, but the defense was based on fear. Every element seemed to pull the story in two different directions. The 41 blows remained the most haunting detail. Numbers can make a crime feel easy to understand, but here the number only created more questions. 41 suggested duration, repetition, and extraordinary force. Yet the defense argued that counting the injuries afterward could not recreate the emotional state of the person who had delivered them. A jury had to consider the possibility that a person experiencing extreme fear might behave in ways that would appear incomprehensible once the danger had passed. That idea continues to divide people who study the case. Some see the verdict as an example of the legal system correctly protecting the right of a person to defend herself. Others see it as a failure to hold someone accountable for a brutal killing. Both interpretations begin with the same evidence, but they assign different meanings to it. Candy herself eventually moved away from the center of public attention. Life continued, but the past could not be completely erased. Her name remained attached to Betty Gore's death, and every new discussion of the case reopened questions that had never received an answer that satisfied everyone. The case also became a warning about judging a violent event only through its final image. A crime scene can show consequences, but it cannot show fear. It can show wounds, but it cannot show intention. It cannot perfectly capture the thoughts of the people involved. That limitation matters because Betty could not describe what happened. Her silence is one of the most painful aspects of the story. Candy survived and was able to give her account. Betty did not. As a result, history has largely preserved the confrontation through perspective of the person who walked away alive. That does not automatically make Candy's account false. It simply means that one side of the confrontation can never be independently recovered through testimony from the person who died. This uncertainty is what keeps the case alive. The legal system made its decision in 1980. The jury heard the evidence and returned a verdict of not guilty. There was no prison sentence for Candy Montgomery. There was no later murder conviction replacing that verdict. The courtroom chapter was finished. But history does not operate like a courtroom. History keeps asking questions. Could the killing have been prevented? Did the affair create tensions that neither woman could control? Did Betty truly threaten Candy with the axe? Did Candy understand the danger as immediate and deadly? Did fear control her actions? Or did anger play a greater role than she admitted? There is no surviving witness who can answer every question. What can be established is that on June 13, 1980, Betty Gore died inside her own home during a confrontation with Candy Montgomery. The weapon was an axe. The attack involved extreme violence. The two women were connected through a community, and the conflict was linked to Candy's previous relationship with Alan Gore. Candy claimed self-defense, and a jury ultimately accepted that the prosecution had not proved murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Those facts form the skeleton of the case. Everything else exists in the space between evidence and interpretation. That space is why the story continues to fascinate people decades later. It is not simply a murder case. It is a case about how ordinary lives can contain hidden conflicts, how quickly private emotions can become deadly, and how difficult it can be to determine exactly what happened when the most important witness is no longer alive. The house in Wiley looked ordinary before the killing. Afterward, it became a symbol of everything the community had failed to see. The friendship, affair, confrontation, and verdict created a story that seemed almost too contradictory to be real. Yet the tragedy was real, and Betty Gore was a person who paid the ultimate price. Candy Montgomery walked out of the courtroom free. Betty Gore never walked out her home. And that simple contrast remains at the heart of the case. For some, the verdict represents reasonable doubt and the right to defend oneself against a deadly threat. For others, it represents one of Texas's most controversial acquittals. But whichever interpretation a person accepts, the case leaves the same unsettling lesson behind. Sometimes the most frightening crimes do not begin with strangers. They begin with people who know each other, trust each other, and believe they understand the lives unfolding around them. On that June day, the illusion of safety disappeared. The trial ended. The questions remained. The trial of Candy Montgomery became the moment when the quiet suburban world surrounding Wiley, Texas, collided with the horrifying reality of Betty Gore's death. What made the proceeding so compelling was not simply the violence of the crime, but the extraordinary contrast between the two women at the center of the case. Candy appeared to many people as an ordinary wife, mother, and member of the local community. Betty was a young mother whose life had ended inside her own home. Yet standing before the jury was not a simple story of an obvious murderer and an unquestionable victim. Instead, the defense presented a complicated account of fear, confrontation, memory, and self-preservation, while prosecutors sought to persuade the jury that the killing could not reasonably be explained as self-defense. By the time the case reached court, the relationship between Candy and Alan Gore was already central to the public understanding of what had happened. Candy and Alan had previously been involved in an extramarital relationship. The affair had ended, and Alan had returned to his marriage with Betty. That history gave prosecutors an obvious framework for the confrontation. Candy had a personal connection to the Gore family. She knew about the tensions within their marriage, and she had been present at Betty's home on the day Betty died. To the prosecution, these circumstances made it possible to argue that the encounter was connected to the emotional consequences of the affair. The defense, however, offered a very different interpretation. Candy acknowledged the affair and did not attempt to build her case around denying that relationship. Instead, the defense focused on what Candy said happened inside the house. According to her account, Betty confronted her about Alan and became angry. Candy maintained that Betty threatened her with an axe, turning what might have begun as a difficult conversation into a physical struggle. Candy said that she eventually gained control of the weapon, and that the situation continued in a terrifying and chaotic way. Her explanation was that she had not arrived intending to kill Betty, and that she had acted because she believed she was in danger. For the jury, this created a difficult question. Self-defense does not depend simply on whether a person was frightened. The circumstances surrounding the use of deadly force must be considered, including what the person reasonably believed at the time and whether the force used could be understood as necessary under those circumstances. The prosecution therefore had to challenge the credibility and logic of Candy's account. The enormous number of injuries inflicted on Betty became one of the most disturbing features of the evidence. Betty had suffered 41 wounds involving the axe, and the brutality of the attack made the idea of a defensive reaction extremely difficult for many observers to understand. The prosecution could point to the sheer violence of the encounter and ask the jury to consider whether a person acting purely to protect herself would continue attacking after the immediate danger had passed. The number of injuries became more than a gruesome detail. It was part of the larger question about Candy's state of mind, and whether her actions were consistent with self-defense. If Candy had intended to kill Betty, the violence could be interpreted as evidence supporting that theory. If Candy had genuinely believed she was trapped in a life-threatening struggle, however, the same evidence had to be interpreted within the context of her claimed fear and confusion of the confrontation. The defense needed to give the jury a reason to believe that Candy's behavior, however shocking, could occur during extreme psychological crisis. Testimony about psychological responses to intense fear became important to that strategy. The defense sought to portray the encounter not as a carefully planned killing, but as an explosive confrontation in which Candy's perception of danger and her ability to control her actions had been severely affected. The purpose was not necessarily to make the violence appear ordinary. It was to help the jury understand how an apparently ordinary woman could become involved in an extraordinarily violent event without necessarily having entered the house with deliberate plan to murder. The courtroom thus became a contest between two narratives. In the prosecution's narrative, the affair provided a motive, and the confrontation with Betty ended in a deliberate and extraordinarily violent killing. In the defense narrative, the affair was part of the background, but it did not establish an intention to murder. Candy had gone to Betty's house. An argument had developed. Betty had allegedly threatened her with an axe, and Candy had responded during a terrifying physical struggle. The same facts could therefore be arranged into two dramatically different stories. The jury ultimately had to decide whether the prosecution had proved Candy's guilt to the required legal standard. This was not a referendum on whether the killing was horrifying. It was not a judgment about whether Candy's affair had been morally acceptable. It had not been. And it was not simply a decision about which woman the jurors found more sympathetic. After considering the evidence and arguments, the jury returned its verdict. Candy Montgomery was found not guilty. The decision stunned many people who had followed the case. Betty Gore was dead, and the circumstances of her death were exceptionally violent. Yet, Candy would not go to prison for the killing. The verdict did not mean that everyone accepted every part of Candy's account. It meant that the jury did not find the prosecution's case sufficient to convict her under the applicable legal standard. In practical terms, the courtroom had rejected a guilty verdict, leaving Candy legally free. For those who believed the killing could only be understood as an intentional act, the verdict was difficult to accept. The violence seemed incompatible with the image of self-defense that the defense had presented. For others, the case demonstrated why criminal trials cannot be decided solely by emotional reactions to disturbing evidence. The jury had to consider the circumstances surrounding the confrontation and the possibility that Candy had genuinely perceived herself to be in danger. The verdict also revealed how complicated the boundary between self-defense and excessive violence can become when there is no surviving eyewitness to describe the crucial moments. Betty could not explain what happened inside the house. Candy was the only surviving participant in the confrontation, and her account therefore carried enormous importance. The jury had to evaluate that account alongside the physical evidence, the testimony presented in court, and the arguments of both sides. The trial did not erase the questions surrounding Betty's final moments. Instead, the not guilty verdict ensured that those questions will remain part of the case's lasting legacy. People could disagree about Candy's motives, about the meaning of the injuries, and about what happened during the confrontation, while still acknowledging that the jury had reached a definitive legal conclusion. Candy Montgomery eventually left the area and attempted to continue her life away from the intense attention surrounding the case. But the trial remained embedded in the history of Wiley and in the broader story of American true crime. What began as a private relationship between two married adults had become a public tragedy involving betrayal, friendship, fear, violence, and an extraordinary courtroom defense. The most unsettling aspect of the trial was therefore not simply that Candy was acquitted. It was that the case forced ordinary assumptions about violence to collide with the complexities of human behavior and criminal law. A person who appeared to be living a conventional suburban life had become the defendant in a murder trial. A woman who had been part of the same social world had died violently, and the explanation for that death depended almost entirely on how the jury understood a few critical minutes inside a private home. The verdict closed the criminal case, but it did not close the debate. For some, Candy Montgomery remains a woman who escaped punishment for a brutal killing. For others, She remains an example of how a frightening confrontation can produce extreme violence without proving an intention to murder. The jury made its decision in the courtroom, and that decision gave Candy her freedom. But the unanswered questions surrounding Betty Gore's death ensured that the case would continue to haunt the public imagination long after the trial had ended. After the verdict, the legal story of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore had reached its official conclusion. But the emotional story was far from over. The courtroom had answered one question. Candy Montgomery would not be convicted for Betty Gore's death. Yet the verdict could not answer every question about what happened inside the Gore home on June 13, 1980. It could not restore Betty to her children, explain every second of the confrontation, or make the community forget the violence that had occurred behind an ordinary suburban door. That unresolved quality became one of the reasons the case endured. Almost every major element seemed to contain a contradiction. Candy was not a stranger who appeared from nowhere. She was part of the same social environment as Betty. She knew the family. She had been involved with Alan Gore. The affair had ended, yet its consequences remained. Then came a confrontation that ended with Betty dead, and Candy claiming that she had acted in self-defense. For people in Wiley, the case carried an additional sense of shock because it emerged from a familiar social world. This was not a story set in an isolated place where people involved had no connections to one another. The families belonged to the same community, attended social and religious activities, and lived lives that appeared, from the outside, remarkably ordinary. The tragedy therefore challenged the comforting assumption that violent crime belongs somewhere else, among people who seem obviously dangerous. Betty's death also left a personal tragedy that could never be resolved by the verdict. She was a mother, a wife, and a member of a community that had known her before the crime. Her children were left to grow up with the consequences of a death they could not undo. Alan Gore had to live with the loss of his wife, while also confronting the fact that his relationship with Candy had become part of the circumstances surrounding Betty's death. No courtroom verdict could separate those personal consequences from the case. At the same time, Candy's acquittal created its own complicated aftermath. Being found not guilty meant that she was legally cleared of criminal responsibility, but acquittal did not guarantee that everyone would believe her. Some people continued to regard the violence as evidence that her account could not be accepted. Others considered the verdict proof that the prosecution had failed to establish guilt beyond the required legal standard. These positions could exist simultaneously, because a person can recognize the authority of a verdict while still having unanswered questions about the underlying events. The case also became a lasting example in discussions about self-defense. At its heart was an uncomfortable legal and moral problem. When someone claims that deadly force was necessary to survive a confrontation, how should a jury reconstruct the person's state of mind after the fact? The jurors are not watching the event unfold in real time. They are looking backward, examining testimony and physical evidence after the danger has ended. The difference between a justified response and an unlawful killing can depend on circumstances that lasted only moments. That problem became even more difficult because Betty was unable to provide her own account. Candy was a surviving participant, and her description of the confrontation was therefore crucial. The jury had to evaluate whether her version was sufficiently credible when considered alongside the physical evidence. The prosecution carried the burden of proving the criminal charge. That distinction helps explain why the verdict could be legally valid even though the case remained emotionally disturbing. Over time, the story attracted renewed attention through books, television programs, documentaries, podcasts, and fictionalized adaptations. Some focus on the affair, Betty's final hours, the psychology presented during the trial, or the contrast between suburban normality and extreme violence. With every retelling came the possibility of simplifying the story. True crime narratives often divide people into recognizable roles: victim, killer, motive, evidence, verdict. The Montgomery case resists that structure. Betty was unquestionably the victim of a fatal attack, but understanding the circumstances of that attack requires confronting uncertainty. Candy was acquitted, but the acquittal does not provide a complete reconstruction of every moment inside the house. Alan was connected to the affair, yet the killing cannot be reduced to a simple story of marital jealousy. The more closely the case is examined, the more complicated the relationships become. That complexity is also why the number 41 became so powerful in the public memory of the case. It represents the extraordinary brutality of Betty's injuries and immediately raises questions about the nature of the confrontation. But a number alone cannot explain a person's mental state. It cannot tell us exactly what Candy believed after the first blow, how quickly events unfolded, or when the confrontation changed from struggle to fatal assault. Those are precisely the questions that made the trial so difficult. The case, therefore, remains suspended between certainty and uncertainty. We know Betty Gore died in her home. We know an axe was used. We know Candy Montgomery was responsible for the fatal attack in the sense that she admitted causing Betty's death, while maintaining that she did so in self-defense. We know the jury heard the evidence and found her not guilty. What remains disputed is the interpretation connecting those facts. There is another reason the story continues to attract attention. It exposes a distance between legal truth and personal belief. A courtroom operates according to rules of evidence, burdens of proof, and standards designed to protect defendants from wrongful conviction. Public opinion often operates differently. People react to photographs, descriptions, relationships, emotions, and the apparent brutality of an event. Those reactions can be powerful, but they are not the same thing as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That tension between what can be proven and what people believe is at the heart of the case's enduring power. More than 4 decades later, the case has become part of Texas true crime history precisely because it refuses to provide an easy ending. The verdict is final in the criminal case, but the debate surrounding it continues. Some people see Candy Montgomery as a woman who survived a violent confrontation and was correctly acquitted. Others see the same evidence and believe the punishment avoided by the verdict was unjust. Between those positions lies a permanent uncertainty about what happened during the final minutes of Betty Gore's life. The case did not begin with strangers, a robbery, or an obvious threat. It began within a community where people knew one another, trusted one another, attended the same social events, and appeared to share the ordinary concerns of family life. Behind that normal appearance were secrets, emotional conflicts, and decisions whose consequences became irreversible. Betty Gore's name remains attached to the tragedy because her life was reduced, in the public imagination, to the circumstances of her death. Yet she was more than the victim described in a courtroom. Candy Montgomery, likewise, became more than a defendant at the center of a sensational trial. The case turned both women into symbols in a story that continues to be retold, debated, and reinterpreted. In the end, the most important fact about the verdict is also the simplest. Candy Montgomery was found not guilty. The law allowed her to walk away from the courtroom without a murder conviction. That decision cannot change what happened to Betty, nor can it guarantee that everyone will agree about why it happened. It can only establish the legal conclusion reached by the jury at the end of the trial. And so the story of Wiley's axe murder remains unsettling, not because it has no ending, but because its ending does not satisfy everyone. There was a death, there was a trial, and there was an acquittal. Beyond those facts lies a question that has survived for decades. What truly happened inside that house, in those few minutes when an ordinary suburban relationship became a tragedy that neither woman could ever escape? The story of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore has survived for decades because it sits at the uncomfortable intersection of ordinary life and extraordinary violence. In many true crime cases, investigators can reconstruct a clear sequence of events from witnesses, physical evidence, records, and confessions. The Wiley case is different. Although the broad facts are known, the most important moments remain filtered through one surviving participant's account and a courtroom verdict that did not convince everyone who heard about the case. That uncertainty is part of what makes the final chapter so difficult. Betty Gore was killed inside her own home on June 13, 1980. Candy Montgomery was responsible for the attack that caused Betty's death, but she maintained that she had acted in self-defense after Betty confronted and threatened her. A jury ultimately accepted that the prosecution had not established guilt beyond the required legal standard and found Candy not guilty. From a legal perspective, the case ended there. From a human perspective, however, the questions continued. One of the most important distinctions is between what is known and what is interpreted. It is known that Candy and Alan Gore had an affair. It is known that the affair ended and that Alan remained with Betty. It is known that Candy went to Betty's house on the day of the killing. It is known that an axe was involved and that Betty suffered 41 injuries. It is known that Candy later acknowledged causing Betty's death. It is also known that she claimed the confrontation began with Betty threatening her and that she acted because she feared for her life. What cannot be recovered with absolute certainty is the precise sequence of every movement during those final moments. Betty could not tell her side of the story in court. There was no independent witness standing in the room. That absence created a problem that could never be completely solved. The physical evidence could demonstrate the severity of the attack, but physical evidence does not automatically reveal intention. It can show what happened to a body without providing a complete explanation of what the person holding the weapon believed at each moment. This distinction matters because the public often treats a dramatic number as if it were a complete answer. They immediately create an emotional reaction, and understandably so. Yet the number alone cannot establish whether the killing was planned, whether Candy genuinely believed she remained in danger, or precisely when her actions changed from offense to something else. Those questions require an interpretation of the circumstances, and that interpretation was ultimately left to the jury. The case also demonstrates how strongly personal relationships can shape the way people understand violent crime. Without the affair between Candy and Alan, the encounter between Candy and Betty would look entirely different. The affair gave the confrontation an emotional history. It created a connection between the women that was painful and complicated, but it does not automatically prove a murder motive. An affair can provide context without providing a complete explanation for an act of violence. Likewise, Betty should not be remembered only through the circumstances of her death. In retellings, victims can easily become characters whose identities are defined by the crime committed against them. Betty was a mother, a wife, and a person living within a community before she became the victim of a notorious killing. Her death had consequences for her children, her husband, relatives, friends, and people who had known the family. The legal case ended with an acquittal, but the private grief created by Betty's death had no such ending. Candy's life after the trial presents another complicated dimension. An acquittal does not mean that public suspicion disappears. It means that the defendant has not been convicted of the criminal charge. Candy could leave the courtroom without a murder conviction, but she could not control how other people interpreted the case. To some, the verdict represented a proper application of self-defense law. To others, it appeared impossible to reconcile with the brutality of Betty's injuries. Both reactions became part of the case's long afterlife. Over the years, the story was repeatedly transformed through books, television coverage, documentaries, podcasts, and dramatizations. Every retelling brought the case to a new audience, but also introduced a danger turning uncertainty into certainty. A dramatic narrative naturally seeks a motive, a villain, and a definitive explanation. The evidence may establish some facts while leaving other questions permanently unresolved. That is especially important when discussing Candy's state of mind. It is tempting to describe her simply as either a calculating killer or a completely innocent victim. Neither label captures the complexity of the case. The jury's verdict does not require the public to believe every detail of Candy's account, just as the existence of extraordinary violence does not by itself prove a particular criminal intention. The legal question was narrower, whether the prosecution had proved the charge sufficiently for a conviction. The distinction between legal judgment and moral judgment is one of the most enduring lessons of the case. People can believe that an affair was deeply wrong and still recognize that adultery is not proof of murder. People can find the violence horrifying and still understand that a defendant is entitled to the presumption of innocence. People can feel sympathy for Betty's family, while also acknowledging that a criminal conviction requires evidence meeting a demanding standard. These principles can exist together, even when emotions make them difficult to separate. The case also raises broader questions about how people remember women involved in violent crimes. Candy did not fit the image many people expected from a murder defendant. She was a suburban mother with an established social identity. That contrast became part of the fascination surrounding the trial. The idea that someone who appeared ordinary could become involved in such a violent confrontation challenged assumptions about who is capable of extreme behavior. Yet perhaps the most unsettling lesson is that appearances can conceal complicated realities without necessarily revealing what those realities mean. The people involved were not fictional characters designed to fit simple roles. They had relationships, frustrations, fears, mistakes, responsibilities, and private conflicts. The tragedy emerged from that human complexity, not from a story that can be reduced to one emotion or one decision. More than 40 years later, the case continues to provoke the same central question. Was the verdict a recognition of genuine self-defense, or did the legal system fail to hold Candy responsible for a brutal killing? There is no new courtroom answer waiting at the end of that question. The criminal case is over. Ultimately, the legacy of the case belongs to more than the person who was acquitted. Betty Gore's death remains the central tragedy. Candy Montgomery's acquittal remains the central legal outcome. Alan Gore's affair remains an important part of the background. The 41 injuries remain the most disturbing physical fact, and the absence of a surviving second witness remains one of the reasons the precise truth of the confrontation can never be completely reconstructed. The case endures because these facts do not form a comfortable conclusion. They form a question. A quiet Texas community witnessed the collapse of an ordinary social world, and a private conflict became a public courtroom drama. The law eventually delivered its verdict, but history continued asking for an explanation. Perhaps that is why the story still feels unresolved. Betty's life ended in a matter of minutes, while the debate over those minutes has lasted generations. Candy walked away from the courtroom legally free, but the case followed her through history. The jury could decide whether there was enough evidence for a conviction. It could not decide what every future generation would believe. And that is where the story finally leaves us. Not with another shocking revelation, but with the recognition that some mysteries survive even when the courtroom has closed. The facts can be studied, the testimony can be examined, and the verdict can be understood. But the exact truth of those final moments between Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore remains a question that no later retelling can answer with absolute certainty. The story of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore did not end when the courtroom doors closed. In some ways, that was only the beginning of a different kind of life for everyone connected to the case. The verdict had settled the criminal question, but it could not settle the private grief, the public suspicion, or the arguments about what had really happened inside Betty's home. Decades later, the case still attracts attention because it combines an ordinary suburban setting with an extraordinary act of violence and a verdict that many people continue to find difficult to understand. For Betty Gore's family, there was never going to be a satisfactory ending. A jury could decide the legal fate of Candy Montgomery, but no verdict could restore Betty to the children who had lost their mother. The circumstances of her death became part of their family history, whether they wanted that history to be public or not. The passage of time could soften some wounds, but it could not change the basic fact that a normal day had ended with Betty dead inside her own home. For the wider Wiley community, the killing became a permanent reminder that appearances can be deceptive. Before the tragedy, the people involved were not characters in a crime story. They were neighbors, parents, friends, church members, and acquaintances living ordinary lives. They had routines, disagreements, friendships, marriages, and secrets. The crime shattered the illusion that a familiar community could somehow be protected from the kind of violence normally associated with distant headlines. Candy's acquittal created another layer of complexity. She was legally entitled to leave the courtroom without a murder conviction, and the jury had reached its decision after hearing the evidence presented at trial. Yet legal freedom and public acceptance are not the same thing. Some people continue to believe that the violence was impossible to reconcile with self-defense. Others viewed the acquittal as evidence that the prosecution had failed to prove a criminal killing beyond a reasonable doubt. The disagreement did not disappear after the trial. It simply moved outside the courtroom. That distinction is essential when looking back at the case today. A verdict is not a complete historical reconstruction. It is a legal decision based on the evidence and arguments available to a jury at a particular moment. The jury was not asked to explain every detail of the confrontation. It was asked to determine whether the prosecution had established the charged crime to the required standard. When the answer was no, the only lawful outcome was an acquittal. The public, however, often asks a different question. People want to know what happened, why it happened, and whether the person who caused the death deserved punishment. Those questions are understandable, but they do not always have simple answers. The available evidence can establish some facts while leaving other facts uncertain. In this case, The affair between Candy and Alan is documented as part of the background. Betty's death is undeniable. The axe attack is undeniable. Candy's role in the fatal confrontation is also established through her own account. What remains disputed is the meaning of the confrontation and the precise mental state behind the violence. That uncertainty is one reason the case has been repeatedly retold. Every new generation discovers the same story and reacts to the same contradictions. Candy did not look like the stereotypical image of a murderer. Betty did not look like the victim of a crime that would become famous across the country. The setting was not a dark alley or an isolated building. It was a home and a community where people knew one another. That familiarity makes a tragedy feel closer and, perhaps more disturbing, the story also demonstrates how quickly private decisions can create consequences that cannot be reversed. Candy and Alan's affair was a private relationship, but once Betty became aware of it, the emotional consequences reached far beyond the two people who had participated. The affair became part of the circumstances surrounding a confrontation that ended in death. That does not mean the affair alone explains the killing. It does, however, show how hidden conflicts can become dangerously important when they collide with fear, anger, humiliation, or resentment. Another reason the case remains memorable is the physical violence involved. Betty suffered 41 injuries during the attack, a fact that has become inseparable from the public image of the crime. The number is shocking, but it should not be treated as a complete explanation. Violence can be described numerically, yet numbers cannot reveal exactly what a person thought during a rapidly unfolding struggle. They cannot independently determine whether an action was planned, impulsive, defensive, or driven by some combination of emotions. Those questions were part of the interpretation that the jury had to make. The case therefore sits at the boundary between evidence and interpretation. Investigators could examine the scene. Attorneys could question witnesses and experts. The defense could present Candy's account and its explanation of her psychological state. The prosecution could challenge that account and emphasize the circumstances of Betty's death. But none of these procedures could recreate the missing minutes perfectly. The courtroom could only work with the evidence that remained. The most responsible way to remember the case is, therefore, to preserve the distinction between fact, allegation, testimony, and interpretation. Betty Gore died violently in her home. Candy Montgomery was prosecuted for the killing and was found not guilty. The jury rejected conviction. Everything beyond them requires greater caution. That caution does not make the story less disturbing. If anything, it makes the case more unsettling because uncertainty leaves room for questions that cannot be conclusively answered. What exactly did Betty say before the confrontation became physical? At what point did Candy believe her life was in danger? How long did the struggle last? When did the immediate threat, if there was one, end? What was Candy thinking during the attack? These questions have been debated for decades, but no later retelling can provide a perfect record of moments that were never witnessed by an independent observer. There is also a danger in allowing the notoriety of the case to overshadow Betty herself. True crime stories often become fascinated with the person accused of killing, while the victim becomes little more than a name attached to a crime scene. Betty deserves to be remembered as a complete person whose life existed before the tragedy. She had a family, relationships, responsibilities, hopes, and an identity that cannot be reduced to the 41 injuries that ended her life. At the same time, Candy's acquittal should be understood within the legal system rather than through the assumption that an acquittal automatically proves every part of a defendant's story. The jury did not have to declare that every detail of Candy's account was unquestionably true. It had to determine whether the prosecution had proved the criminal charge sufficiently for a conviction. The distinction between those two ideas is crucial, especially in a case where the evidence and interpretations remain controversial. Ultimately, the lasting power of the Wiley case comes from the fact that it offers no comfortable moral lesson. It is not simply a story about an evil stranger entering a peaceful neighborhood. It is a story about people who knew one another, choices made in private, emotions that were difficult to contain, and a confrontation whose consequences became irreversible. It reminds us that ordinary appearances do not guarantee ordinary outcomes. More than 4 decades after Betty Gore's death, the courtroom verdict remains unchanged. Candy Montgomery was found not guilty, and the criminal case ended without a murder conviction. But history does not always end when a legal case ends. The questions surrounding the confrontation have continued because people want certainty where the surviving evidence cannot always provide it. Perhaps that is the final tragedy of the story. Betty lost her life. Her family lost someone irreplaceable, and a community lost its sense of security. Candy gained her legal freedom, but the notoriety of the case became part of her history. The jury gave the courtroom its answer, but it could not give the world a definitive explanation for every moment inside that house. In the end, the case remains a reminder that justice, truth, memory, and public opinion are not always the same thing. The law reached its conclusion in 1980. The debate did not. And perhaps that is why the name of Candy Montgomery and the death of Betty Gore continue to be remembered together decades after the violence ended. The house became a crime scene, the courtroom became a battleground of competing narratives, and the verdict became a source of lasting controversy. What remains is not a mystery without facts, but a documented tragedy whose most important unanswered questions may never be resolved. More than 4 decades have passed since the death of Betty Gore, yet the case continues to occupy a strange place in American true crime. It is remembered not because every question remains completely unknown, but because the known facts create a story that seems almost impossible to reconcile. A quiet Texas community, 2 women who knew each other, an affair that was supposed to have ended, a confrontation inside a home, a brutal axe attack, and finally, an acquittal that left many people convinced that the legal answer and emotional answer were 2 different things. To understand why the story continues to attract attention, it is important to look beyond the sensational details. The violence naturally draws attention, especially the fact that Betty suffered 41 injuries during the attack. But the number alone does not explain the event. It tells us something about the terrible physical reality Betty experienced, yet it cannot reveal exactly what either woman believed during the confrontation. That uncertainty is where the case has remained alive. Candy Montgomery's account became the central explanation presented to the public. She maintained that she had not gone to Betty's house intending to kill her. According to Candy, the conversation became hostile after Betty confronted her about Alan. Candy said Betty threatened her with an axe, and that a struggle followed. She described herself as reacting to a perceived threat and ultimately gaining control of the weapon. The defense built its case around that interpretation, asking the jury to consider not simply what happened, but what Candy believed was happening at the time. The prosecution offered a different framework. The affair provided a clear connection between Candy and the Gore family, and Betty's knowledge of that relationship gave the confrontation an emotional background. Prosecutors could ask the jury to consider whether the meeting was really as innocent as Candy suggested, and whether the extraordinary violence was consistent with a deliberate killing rather than a defensive response. They did not need the public to agree with every detail of their theory. They needed the jury to find that the evidence established criminal guilt. The jury did not reach that conclusion. Candy was found not guilty. That verdict remains one of the most discussed aspects of the case because it can easily be misunderstood. An acquittal does not necessarily mean that a jury determined every element of the defendant's story to be proven true. It means the prosecution did not prove the charged offense to the standard required for conviction. In a criminal courtroom, that distinction is fundamental. A defendant can be acquitted even when serious questions remain about the events, because the burden rests with the prosecution. For people who looked at the injuries and felt certain that an intentional murder had occurred, the verdict was difficult to accept. The physical evidence appeared overwhelmingly violent. To them, the idea that such an attack could be connected to self-defense seemed impossible. Others focused on the uncertainty surrounding the confrontation itself. Betty could not testify. There was no independent witness who could describe every movement. Candy's account, therefore, had to be evaluated against the physical evidence and the other testimony available at trial. This difference between emotional certainty and legal certainty is one of the most important lessons of the case. Human beings naturally want a story that makes sense. When someone dies violently, people search for a motive, a reason, and a person who could be held responsible. The law asks a narrower question. It asks whether the evidence satisfies a particular burden of proof. Those 2 processes can produce different conclusions without either one being dishonest. The tragedy also raises questions about the way communities remember victims. Betty's death became famous, but fame is not the same as remembrance. In the years after the killing, the circumstances of her death became far better known than many details of her life. The public learned about the affair, the confrontation, the acts, the injuries, and the trial. Yet Betty had existed long before any of those events. She was a mother, a wife, a friend, and a person with an ordinary life that was abruptly transformed into the subject of a criminal investigation. That transformation is common in true crime. A victim becomes associated almost entirely with the final hours of life. The crime becomes a dominant story, and everything that came before it disappears. Remembering Betty as a whole person is therefore important, especially because the notoriety of the case can otherwise reduce her identity to the circumstances of her death. Candy's acquittal did not make the case disappear from public discussion. Instead, it became part of her identity in the eyes of strangers. Some saw her as an innocent woman who survived a terrifying confrontation. Others saw her as a killer who had escaped punishment. The legal record could establish the verdict, but it could not control private beliefs about what happened. Over time, the case became increasingly detached from the community where it had occurred. Books and later adaptations introduced the story to audiences who had never been to Wiley and had no connection to the people involved. Each retelling had to make decisions about emphasis. One version might focus on the affair. Another might emphasize the psychological defense. Another might center on the brutality of Betty's death. These choices could influence how audiences understood the same underlying facts. That is why careful language matters when discussing the case today. There is a difference between saying that Candy claimed something happened and stating that it definitely happened. There is a difference between saying the jury accepted an acquittal and saying that the jury proved Candy was innocent. There is also a difference between acknowledging that Candy caused Betty's death and declaring that her legal acquittal was proof of a particular motive or state of mind. The case is strongest when those distinctions are preserved. Its real complexity does not need exaggeration. The documented facts are already disturbing enough. A woman died inside her home after an extraordinary confrontation. Another woman admitted causing the fatal injuries, but maintained that she acted in self-defense. A jury heard the competing accounts and returned a verdict of not guilty. Everything that followed became part of the long debate over what those facts meant. The Wiley case therefore remains relevant not only as a crime story, but as a story about uncertainty. It shows how difficult it can be to reconstruct a private confrontation after the fact. It shows why juries must separate emotion from proof. It shows how an acquittal can end a criminal prosecution without ending public debate. And it shows how the memory of a victim can become overshadowed by the controversy surrounding the person accused of killing her. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is that the courtroom could only answer the question placed before it. The jury could decide whether Candy should be convicted. It could not explain every second of Betty's final encounter. It could not tell Betty's children why their mother was gone. It could not undo the affair or the decisions that preceded the confrontation. It could not restore the ordinary life that existed in Wiley before June 13, 1980. Decades later, the case still invites the same uncomfortable question. Can a legal verdict provide closure when the underlying story remains disputed? In the Montgomery case, the answer appears to be no. The verdict closed the prosecution, but it did not close the argument. And perhaps that is why the shadow of the Wiley axe murder has lasted so long. It is not simply a story about a weapon or a courtroom. It is a story about how quickly ordinary relationships can become dangerous, how difficult it is to know another person's private thoughts, and how imperfectly the past can be reconstructed. Betty Gore's death remains the central tragedy. Candy Montgomery's acquittal remains the central legal fact. Between those two facts lies a space filled with questions that history has never completely answered. The case may never provide the satisfying ending that audiences expect from true crime. There is no final revelation waiting to transform the story into something simple. Instead, there is a verdict, a documented death, a contested account, and decades of debate. The people of Wiley moved forward, generations changed, and the world around the case transformed. Yet the essential question remained. What happened during those final minutes inside Betty Gore's home? The jury answered the legal question in 1980. History has continued to ask the human one.